Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Hello, everybody. Welcome, everyone. I'm Gloria Duffy, President and CEO of the Commonwealth Club. So happy to welcome you here this evening. I'd like to introduce, among our many friends and cohorts at the Commonwealth Club, the chair of our board is here, Martha Ryan, her husband, Greg Ryan. So happy to have Martha's strength and support and leadership for this organization. So this evening, we are hosting the inaugural George P. Shultz Lecture, which is brought to you in partnership with the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. Thank you, everyone who's joining us here in person. It is great to see people in person, isn't it, these days? And thank you to all who are joining us online for this important discussion. We have quite a number of people registered and joining us through the internet. This new series is spearheaded and supported by the Toby Philanthropies. And I want to thank you, Tad and Diane Toby, for your support of this event, for joining us here this evening, where we are meeting in the Toby Auditorium. Thank you for your support for the club and for supporting this incredible new series to celebrate the life and legacy of an extraordinary American statesman and our very good friend here in the Bay Area, George Shultz. A little more than 1 year ago, Mr. Shultz passed away at the age of 100. He was one of this country's most distinguished public servants ever. He served as secretary in 3 U.S. administrations, as Secretary of Labor, Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Secretary of the Treasury, and Secretary of State. He was also a longtime friend and participant at the Commonwealth Club. His wife, Charlotte Shultz, served on the Commonwealth Club's board for over 30 years. She was on the board when I arrived 26 years ago, and she was still on the board when she more recently passed away. Mr. Shultz once took me aside and told me that he wanted to tell me what he especially liked about the Commonwealth Club. He was often here. He spoke here. He participated in many activities. And I got ready for him to say something about all of the amazing people that were here, the dialogue, the discussions that went on. And what he told me was that the thing he really valued about the club was that our programs started and ended on time. And of course, he also said many other nice and wonderful things over the years, but to him, that was meaningful because as a very busy person, a very engaged person, the fact that we did our programs, did our activities, and they started and ended, and it was predictable, and he could move on to other things was important for him. That, in a way, minimizes or trivializes his impact and Charlotte's impact. This building that you're in was opened only in 2017. Many people here helped with the building in various ways. Charlotte and George Shultz were the honorary co-chairs of the Capitol campaign that supported us to build this building. So they lent their name. They also threw parties for us, had wonderful parties at their apartment on Green Street for us, helping us to raise funds. And we had many wonderful donors, including the Toby family and others of you here. But their role at the club was fundamental. We really would not be here in this lovely building if they had not lent us their name and their prestige to the building. So throughout his later years, Mr. Shultz continued to be extremely engaged in the diplomatic and political life of the Bay Area, California, the nation, and the world. His influence, you didn't have to look very far to see his influence in many, many different ways, in many different issues. He once told me that he had been the person who whispered in Governor Schwarzenegger's ear that climate change was an important problem and that the governor should look at doing something about that legislatively. He also told me about how on the GM board he had advocated for GM to produce electric vehicles, zero-emission vehicles, and that's why GM had gotten into that field. He was everywhere advising leaders in many, many different fields. It was an honor to me to join him occasionally at the Hoover Institution in particular, as he dedicated himself in his later years to what he saw as the great overarching cause, which was to decrease the danger that we would annihilate ourselves with nuclear weapons. So I'm delighted on many, many counts to welcome you here tonight to celebrate his life and to discuss his legacy with those who worked with him during his life of service and those who are carrying on that work now. Among his many colleagues who wanted to participate in this celebration of his work, first let me introduce one of his distinguished colleagues who could not attend in person but wanted to share her thoughts on George Shultz's legacy. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Condoleezza Rice, 66th U.S. Secretary of State, my good friend, and the Tad and Diane Toby Director of the Hoover Institution at Stanford, who's joining us here virtually.
Hello, I'm Condoleezza Rice, the 66th United States Secretary of State and also a former National Security Advisor. I'm currently the Director of the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. I am honored to welcome everyone to tonight's George P. Shultz Lecture with outstanding panelists representing the Reagan Institute, the Hoover Institution, and Pepperdine University. While I am sorry that I cannot join you in person, I want you to know that tonight's lecture is near and dear to my heart. First, I want to thank my friends Tad and Diane, the visionary and generous underwriters of tonight's lecture. They are people who have throughout their lifetime given generously to causes, generously to the betterment of our country, and they were great, great friends of George Shultz. Thank you to the Commonwealth Club for hosting tonight's lecture and being a fantastic forum for discussions like tonight in our community. Thank you to the Reagan Institute for spearheading tonight's lecture. Secretary Shultz was a longtime trustee of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, and I was honored, at his request, to assume his role as a Reagan Foundation trustee when he stepped down. And thank you to tonight's panelists, Philip Taubman, Karen Skinner, and Frances Tilney Burke. You are all amazing scholars whose insights into George Shultz the man and your expansive understanding of his impact on our nation will make tonight special for everyone involved. I just know that George is looking down and smiling. Finally, I want to honor my friend, Secretary George P. Shultz. George P. Shultz was a great businessman. He was a scholar, an economist. He was a Marine, and he never let you forget that. And he was a great public servant. When I was asked to be Secretary of State, I called him. I said, George, you've had every job in government. He'd been Labor Secretary, Treasury Secretary, Director of OMB. I said, what do you think? He said, well, I think Secretary of State is the best job in government. Well, he should have known, and he did it awfully well, representing our country, representing our values, representing our interest, helping Ronald Reagan to end the Cold War. We are grateful for George P. Shultz and for everything that he did for our country. Because of all of his many titles throughout his lifetime, the one that to my mind describes him most is Patriot. George was fond of wearing a tie to remind all Americans that democracy is not a spectator sport. And certainly he lived that every day of his life. Thank you for honoring my friend. Thank you for honoring our friend, George P. Shultz.
Our thanks to Dr. Rice for sharing those thoughts with us. Now I would like to welcome our partners at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, who are joining us tonight from Washington, D.C., as well as Southern California. Ronald Reagan and George Shultz worked together on some of the most important diplomatic initiatives of our time. And it's only fitting that the Ronald Reagan Institute helped to champion the legacy of Secretary Shultz through this series. I'm delighted to introduce the director of the Ronald Reagan Institute, who will be leading tonight's conversation with our distinguished guests. Please join me in welcoming Roger Zakheim.
Well, thank you, Gloria, for the introduction, and just wonderful to be here in person at the Commonwealth Club. As you heard, my name is Roger Zakheim. I'm the director of the Reagan Institute, which is the D.C. office of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. The home turf is here in California, down in Simi Valley. And it's a real honor to be the moderator this evening. And before we begin, I wanted just to kind of give our own gloss on this event. This inaugural George P. Shultz Lecture is our attempt to honor Secretary Shultz's legacy, the man, the statesman, and a cherished friend and mentor to many in this room. And this is a collaboration, as was noted, between the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation Institute and Toby Philanthropies. We'll be hosting two lectures. Of course, the first and the second one will take place in Washington, D.C. This fall. And this series was originally conceived in honor of Secretary Shultz on the anniversary of his 100th birthday. It was our attempt to celebrate and introduce more people to his incredible achievements and leadership and service in the United States, as Dr. Rice just captured. I want to thank Tad and Diane Toby for their support for this important effort. It's been a long time coming. We've been working on this, and just so happy to be here. And Tad, I know you had such a special relationship with Secretary Shultz, so you being here tonight it makes it all the more meaningful. When I was asked, when Secretary Shultz was asked about his foreign policy while serving as Secretary of State, George Shultz would always answer in the following way, quote, "I do not have one. The President has one. My job is to help formulate it and carry it out." That's not normally a Washington way of answering a question. For this is classic George Shultz, a man who prioritized mission and nation over credit and self-aggrandizement. But tonight, we'll take an opportunity to give credit where credit is due. It would be a daunting task for one person to do justice to George Shultz's remarkable achievements as soldier or statesman, I shouldn't say soldier, as Marine, scholar, and statesman. But fortunately, this evening, we're joined by three luminaries, each of which I'll introduce, and then I'll call them onto the stage. Philip Taubman, Dr. Kyron Skinner, and Francis Burke, and they'll each provide unique perspective into Secretary Shultz's life and legacy. Philip Taubman is a professor at Stanford University, formerly Moscow bureau chief and Washington correspondent for the New York Times. At Stanford, he received exclusive access to George Shultz's private papers to produce the first authorized and comprehensive biography of George Shultz. And you may have seen beforehand an image of what that book will look like when it comes out in January, titled "In the Nation's Service, The Life and Times of George P. Shultz." Dr. Skinner first came to know George Shultz, as I understand, as a research assistant at the Hoover Institution. Dr. Skinner is currently a Tauby Professor of International Relations at Pepperdine University in the School of Public Policy, and previously served Director of the Office of Policy Planning in the U.S. Department of State. Has held other roles in government. Her PhD is from Harvard University and has had many prominent academic posts, but the one I'll note in terms of her accomplishments, she is the author of several books. The one I want to highlight is Reagan in His Own Hand, A Life in Letters, and Reagan, A Life in Letters. And those books did a big service to those who want to understand President Reagan. And Reagan in His Own Hand, of course, had an introduction from George Shultz. Last, Dr. Francis Burke is the George P. Shultz Visiting Fellow at the Ronald Reagan Institute. She holds a PhD in International Relations from the Fletcher School at Tufts University and will soon publish a book on the Reagan administration's policies in Latin America. She's held positions in the Department of Defense prior to her time in academia, and also as a Navy Reserve officer and an intelligence analyst. So I will now, after those introductions, ask them to come to the stage, and we can begin. Please join, and welcome our panelists. But we'll start with Dr. Skinner. Chiron, great to have you here. You, of course, have studied and worked with Secretary Shultz. Thank you. Assessing his diplomacy during the Cold War, that obviously pivotal to, as Margaret Thatcher remarked, the Reagan administration, President Reagan, won the Cold War without firing a shot, and George Shultz was a big part of that. Talk to us about his diplomacy and kind of the principles that guided him during those remarkable years where he served as Secretary of State.
Thanks for that question. If you don't mind, if I take a second, there's so many friends in the room, and it really is like a full circle moment. I've worked with Tad and Diane for decades now, and the books that you mentioned, they help support. Everywhere you turn in the Bay Area, there is a Tad and Diane Toby influence. So I think there's more here than we probably know. But the book Reagan, A Life in Letters would not have been written without their support 20 years ago. It's quite a long time. And Gloria Duffy was, I don't think everyone knows, and that she and Condi Rice were roommates and pre-docs together at Stanford in the 80s, the first group of women to be fellows at the Center for International Security, and I think it's now Arms Control or Cooperation. But they were early fellows. Both of them were mentors of mine. And I remember sitting at Gloria's dining room table after George Shultz offered me the job, figuring out what my salary would be. Gloria's a tough negotiator, so I did better because of her. And so we've all worked together in one way or another. And so
You had to deal with that diplomacy.
I
early
did.
on, huh?
And so I have to say Shultz was unique, and he and Tad, it's no surprise that they would become good friends. And we were together at George Shultz's 95th birthday. Tad and Diane, do you remember? At the Penthouse in San Francisco. Dianne Feinstein was there, Condoleezza Rice, completely bipartisan, a diverse group of friends. I think that party represented his life. And the fact that his version of diplomacy was nonpartisan but pro-American. He cared more about our interest and our values, as Condoleezza Rice has said, than anything else. And so I've not met a senior statesman who was less political in that way. For him, it wasn't party. It was what we now call America First, but in a very different way. And a commitment to community as well. In the later stages of his life, you saw his diplomacy, his emphasis on what the interest of the larger community should be in the work that he did in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, and at the Hoover Institution. I think for him, it was a seamless web from the early years of his life and career to the later ones. The emphasis on the interest and not his personal interest. You mentioned brilliantly that he said, I don't have a foreign policy, the president does. He is probably the last person that I know to really take that view. Condi Rice had that view as well, but most don't. Not just secretaries of state, but cabinet officials. He had no other agenda than fulfilling that of his principle. And for him, and he says it in his memoir, trust is the coin of the realm. And when he could trust someone, he really would work with them over long periods of time. In terms of more specifics on policy, I think the four-part agenda that we've talked about before is underappreciated as the key strategy for ending the Cold War. Instead of working on one or two fronts, the Reagan administration worked on all: arms control, regional disputes with the Soviets, human rights issues, and other bilateral problems. Not one was more important than the other. But if there was a first among equals, it was actually human rights. And in 1983, at the height of the renewed Cold War, with Reagan's SDI speech, his evil empire speech, the fear of nuclear war renewed, Reagan and Shultz were quietly negotiating with Yuri Andropov, the Soviet General Secretary, to release 7 Pentecostals who'd lived for almost 5 years in the basement of the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. And that predated the major arms control shifts, and I think it really began a thaw in relations. So I think the human rights dimension, not just the arms control one, is underappreciated. And as Phil Taubman knows better than anyone, Shultz repeatedly asked to bring Jewish refuseniks on the plane with him wherever he traveled. He said, just let them on my plane, let me bring them home. And the story of Ida Nudell was really a touching one when she called him on the phone when he was at the State Department and said, when she finally got out of the Soviet Union, I'm home.
Well, Karen, thank you for that. And Philip, I wanted to follow up on 2 things that Karen just hit on. First, we'll hit on the human rights piece because we were talking about this before coming to the stage, but in President Reagan's diaries, his first communication that he had with Brezhnev, his personal note, not the note that the State Department handed him, was about Sharansky and the plight of that refusenik. So maybe, Philip, you can take a step back and talk about the place of human rights in Secretary Shultz's legacy. And then also the second piece, what Kyron just hit on, trust is the coin of the realm, because in his later years, I remember the last op-ed I read that he penned, I think it was for the Wall Street Journal. Forgive me, maybe it was the New York Times, Philip, I don't know. But that's what he focused on. And so maybe reflect on that in terms of why that was pivotal to his leadership and what he wanted to see in leaders.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. So when you think of George Shultz and trust, the value of trust, he has a phrase that he used repeatedly. Many of you have probably heard it from him. Trust is the coin of the realm. And you could see that in the way he conducted his business. Helmut Schmidt, the German chancellor, at one point said to me in an interview I did with him for this biography, he said the essential thing with George Shultz was that you could trust him. You could trust him. And as I traced his relationship with different world figures, I could see how he worked on that. And the example I'll give you was Edward Shevardnadze, the Soviet foreign minister. So as many of you remember, when George became Secretary of State, the Soviet foreign minister was Andrei Gromyko, had been in that job for decades. There was no more grim, humorless figure in international diplomacy than Andrei Gromyko. Gorbachev takes over, and within a few months of becoming Soviet leader, he basically kicks Gromyko upstairs, makes him president of the Soviet Union, which at that point was an honorary position. And he appoints Shevardnadze, who comes from Georgia, at the time a Soviet republic. And the two men, Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, had bonded as they rose up through the ranks of the Communist Party. So George Shultz learns that there is now a new Soviet foreign minister, and he's got a meeting set in Helsinki for the first meeting with Shevardnadze, and he says to his wife, Obi Shultz, I want you to come with me. Let's go to Helsinki together, because I think we can have a relationship with Edward Shevardnadze and his wife. And so off they go, and there is this amazing scene in Finlandia Hall in Helsinki, where the U.S. delegation is seated in the front row. It's done under the French, so États-Unis is in front, and the Soviet Union is in the back. Shultz walks in, puts his papers down at the American table, turns around and walks slowly up the steps to the back of the hall where Shevardnadze is seated and shakes his hand. There was a hush in the hall as people watched this. That was their first meeting. Later, as they got to know each other a little bit, George worked out this theatrical encounter with Shevardnadze, where he knew, of course, Shevardnadze came from Georgia, so he figured, let's perform Georgia on my mind, right? So he arranged to have several of the American diplomats in Moscow who spoke fluent Russian. They wrote out the verses of Georgia on my mind in Russian, and they performed it to Shevardnadze, and then George sang it in English. And you could see these men bonding together that day. And then the last piece of this is fast forward. Shevardnadze is now living back in Tbilisi. He had been president of Georgia after it became an independent country. I went to see him. He had advanced Parkinson's disease, and he could barely move around his office, but he sent an aide to the far end of the office to bring him some papers. He put them in his lap, and then he handed them to me. These were the Christmas cards that Charlotte and George Shultz had sent him for over a decade, and he had kept them because that was such an important friendship to him. So why don't I stop there? I've not answered all your questions.
No, but I mean, it does capture kind of the trust piece, and part of that is building meaningful relationships that obviously had an impact, worldwide. Francis, let's shift over to you. As I mentioned, you are working on a book about Reagan's Central American policy. As you've been in the archives, and fortunately been able to do that in person of late, not just virtually. What have you seen while you've been exploring those archives in terms of Secretary Shultz as it relates to your research, and more broadly, what you've come across?
Sure. I should first say it's a very daunting task to be the George P. Shultz Fellow, because it's going to be extremely difficult to step into Secretary Shultz's shoes, but I'm doing my best, and I would like to say how important it is that these fellowships exist for young and mid-career scholars. I'm a huge proponent of applied history, where you learn, from the past, and I think we can all learn from the incredible leadership and collegiality of Secretary George Shultz. And so I'm very pleased to be here as the George P. Shultz Fellow. And to answer your question about the archives, there's one thing I read at the Hoover Library that Philip Taubman did not read. So I wanted to talk about that, among some other things. So I am researching a book on Ronald Reagan's policies in Central America. And of course, George Shultz has a lot to do with that. And one of the people that I interviewed, and he'll remain nameless right now, but he had worked for Secretary Shultz and knew Ronald Reagan very well. And I should have you close your ears as the director of the Ronald Reagan Institute.
Now I'm very interested.
But he said, listen, the policies, Reagan's policies in Central America were George Shultz's policies. And essentially, Reagan followed what George Shultz recommended, which was not just military aid. And that's what a lot of us get from that era, from the 80s, that we're just shoving military aid into Nicaragua and El Salvador. That was not the case. George Shultz was a proponent of economic development, democratization, helping people, and he cared a lot about the people, and he wrote about that, and even in all of his testimony, and that's a lot of the things I read at the Hoover Library, in his papers, these 70, 80, 90 pages of transcripts where he's answering the questions of members of Congress and senators. It's not about military aid, it is a little bit, but it's also about developing a country, or in many countries in Central America, that he felt really needed the leadership and the help of the free world and the leader of the free world. And there's nobody better to do that than the United States. And I'm also very glad that Dr. Duffy didn't say this. I thought she might at the beginning. But George Shultz actually gave a lecture in 1985 at the Commonwealth Club called America and the Struggle for Freedom. And a huge section of that lecture, or that talk, was actually about Latin America. And the thing that really struck me was that George Shultz didn't treat the region in a paternalistic way. And that's very common for the United States to do that, to sort of look down on our neighbors to the south. maybe they need our teaching or they need our leadership. He really gave them policy guidance, but felt strongly and said as much in his lecture at the Commonwealth Club that they could do it. Now, with the support of the United States, of course, they could develop, they could be democracies. And the thing that he pointed out was that in 1979, only 30% of the countries in Latin America were democracies. Right. By the time he gave this speech in 1985, almost 90% of the countries in Latin America were democracies or on the path to democracy. And I do think that George Shultz is the reason for that success.
But you said there was something you found
I forgot
that
to say
Philip
that.
Talman
Sorry,
didn't find.
yeah.
And I'm
rambling.
curious what that is. No, that was great. But Philip's pretty
Yeah.
convinced that he saw every document.
Okay,
No.
sorry. Let me get back to the document.
I told her before we.
She found one. Okay.
I did.
Share it with us quickly.
I'm
I
off
have a
track.
follow-up for Philip.
Okay, so this was the best thing that I found in the library. Little piece of paper, like a buck slip, a piece of paper that you get in the government. He wrote notes. George Shultz wrote notes on July 16th, 1982, which was the first day that he had a staff meeting with all of his senior staff at the Secretary of State. And he wrote himself, as new Secretary of State, and he wrote himself little notes, which I found fascinating. So I'm trying to kind of decipher his handwriting. And he wrote 4 points to himself. And the one that struck out, or struck me, was that he wrote the word integrity. And he wanted to lead a Department of State that had integrity. And he spoke, or he wrote, I should say, quite a bit about how important it was that his staff were members of a team, and that he was part of their team. And to your point, Roger, he said at the beginning of his notes, we all work at the behest of the president. This is not George Shultz's policy, this is Ronald Reagan's policies, and we are here to make them happen. And so it was a really interesting thing to see, all his little sentences, about how he wanted to run his department. But it was also very moving in a way, because you could tell, and we'll get to this at some point, I'm sure, that he is or was a Marine at heart. I come from a military family where you take care of your soldiers, right? When you're the commander. I believe George Shultz took care of his Marines when he was the commander, and when he was the Secretary of State, he took care of his people, and he wrote that in his notes.
Philip, did you not see that buck slip? Is that accurate?
I missed it.
Okay. All right, we can
Thank
always
God.
second edition of the book and can include that in the footnote. But I want to pick up on a thread that Francis just raised, which is, it wasn't Secretary Shultz's first rodeo when he came to the State Department. As was mentioned earlier, right, he had led 3 other departments: Labor, Treasury, OMB, and for very different presidents. President Nixon and then President Reagan. Philip, can you just reflect on kind of how each of those departments and those times leading agencies, the turbulence, of course, of the Nixon administration, prepared him for the role of Secretary of State? And then what do we see? What are the common thread in his leadership role in each of those agencies, ultimately culminating in Foggy Bottom?
So, it's not, I think, well known, it's certainly not as well known as it should be, that as Secretary of Labor in the Nixon administration, George played a pivotal role in the desegregation of urban school systems in the South. There was a task force that was formed that was led by Vice President Spiro Agnew. But Agnew really had no interest in it, and frankly, I don't think was interested in desegregating schools to begin with. So the burden of this task force fell to George Shultz, and he ran it in a way that was indicative of some of his leadership qualities. So what they did, I'll tell you very briefly, they brought delegations from each of the southern states to Washington separately. They brought them to the White House, and then they had Attorney General Mitchell come in and say to the delegations were made up of black leaders and white leaders, people who favored segregation still, and people who wanted to desegregate the schools. Mitchell would come in and say to them, the law says that you have to desegregate. The Supreme Court has said you have to desegregate. But, we would like you to do it voluntarily rather than under the force of federal troops or a federal force of some kind. So they were given a warning, and then Shultz would get them together in the cabinet room at the White House, and they would talk. And the first meeting of this kind was with the Mississippi delegation. So they started talking and they were arguing, and this conversation went on for about 40 minutes. And then Shultz stood up and started to walk out of the room. And one of his aides, one of the White House aides, is running behind him and said, "Mr. Secretary, what are you doing? You know, you have to keep chairing this meeting." And he said, "No. People will come to agreement better on their own than if I sit in there and try to dictate terms to them." And that was his leadership style, and it actually worked in the case of school desegregation. So at Labor, he made a major contribution on civil rights. At Treasury, he played a major role on a number of extremely important economic issues. In fact, the currency valuations, which had been based on the dollar and gold reserves in the United States, that was changed to a plan of floating exchange rates, which is really George Shultz's plan that still exists today. And at OMB, he was the inaugural director, so he was the first person to take the job of budget director, which is what it had been previously, and create this new organization that had been authorized by Congress, the Office of Management and Budget. So by the time and then he came out here and worked at Bechtel after the Nixon administration imploded. When he gets to be Secretary of State, here's a man who is a very skillful manager of large organizations. He's a manager who believes in listening carefully to what people tell him. He's a manager who has faith in the staff that he inherited. I think a lot of appointees to top officials in Washington feel they have to come in with their own entourage. No, when George became Secretary of State, the people that he appointed to senior positions, most of them were career diplomats. That was a signature of his faith in his staff. He was incredibly open-minded. George was always looking around the corner or looking over the horizon. In the mid-1980s, he's in Moscow meeting with Mikhail Gorbachev. They're there to talk about arms control and U.S.-Soviet relations. And what does he do? He stops the conversation at one point, practically gets out a blackboard, and starts talking to Mikhail Gorbachev about the information technology revolution. Mid-1980s, there are no cell phones yet. We're just at the dawn of the IT revolution, and he's in there telling Mikhail Gorbachev, the world's going to change. Closed societies are going to be impacted in unpredictable ways by the IT revolution. So those are a few of his leadership qualities that I think were evident.
And built out over his times. Kyron, I wanted to pick up on a thread that Philip began with, and we talked about this before we got on the stage, which is his career as an academic and in education, and particularly his approach to education and race and managing kind of ahead of the curve in terms of thinking about diversity and all the different ways diversity is important. Give us your take on that, because you had good insight into those issues.
I like how Phil put it, the years at Labor were so critical. I think they are critical to the role that he played in the end of the Cold War. And I think they were informed by his time as an academic. The period in which he was dean of the business school at University of Chicago, I think is where we begin to see his leadership abilities, his sense, how he thinks about interest, his commitment to human rights. And during those years, I think he was maybe the first dean at a major university to go down to the historically black colleges in the South and begin a recruitment program. That was something that he was really proud of. And I think it infused what he did in labor in particular. But labor is important because it's always been of interest to me, and I don't know if anyone's picked up on this. Reagan and Shultz weren't grand strategists like Nixon and Kissinger. But then they ended up having a grand strategy like the 4-part agenda that made a lot more sense than détente. But the big point is that 2 labor men, one a labor negotiator, Schultz, and Reagan, who'd been head of the Screen Actors Guild, representing a labor union, ended the Cold War. I think they looked at it in really practical terms as a bargaining problem. And so they didn't need to get big, grand outcomes. They just kept chipping away at the problems. And they've never really, I think, been given credit for this somewhat mundane approach to diplomacy that had a huge outcome for the international system. And another part of it that I've heard from my co-panelists that I think is important to keep reinforcing, that being principled and having integrity, I think, is a key part of having policy outcomes like the end of the Cold War. If we put different characters in at the head of the State Department and those around Schultz, I don't know if we would have had the outcome that we did. It meant really submerging one's ego to one's principle. And Schultz was not as hardline as Reagan. That's no surprise. But he didn't try to undermine his president and take policy in a radically different direction. That shows restraint and respect. We just don't have that in Washington today, or at least in the administration that I just served in.
So if I can pick up
please
on
go
that
ahead,
for a second. I think you're exactly right about the way they approach the world. And Schultz kind of boiled it down to an axiom that he had, which seems very simple, but it's actually profound in a way when you think about it. He was a consummate problem solver. And the way he put it is, when he tried to solve problems, whether it was desegregation of the Southern school systems, labor disputes, strikes, the Cold War, this is the way he thought about it. When you argue over principle, it's very hard to come to agreement. But if you see the issue as a problem to solve, people are good at solving problems. And that was the approach that he brought really to his role as Secretary of State.
One more follow-up to you, and then, Francis, I want to go back to the military piece. But this dynamic between Secretary Schultz and presidents, I'm going to focus on President Reagan for a moment, because that's where I sit in the Reagan Foundation. I'll have to bring in the Nixon Foundation to get the follow-up question on President Nixon. How did President Reagan view Secretary Schultz? I mean, he wasn't the first pick to become Secretary of State. Of course, that was Al Haig. But, of course, Schultz probably was the most influential cabinet official in his administration. And you read that he would sit next to President Reagan in the Oval, next to his desk, and they go through the speeches and the paperwork. I mean, it became, what strikes me as just an observer, an intimate relationship founded in trust. But give us a sense of how the president viewed his Secretary of State.
Well, the relationship with Reagan didn't start as effectively and constructively as it ended. And the reason is they didn't know each other that well. George Schultz had advised Reagan on economic policy issues when he was governor of California, and then when he was running for president, and then in his first year as president, George was the chair of an economic advisory council. He comes to Washington as Secretary of State in '82, and the two men have not really talked much, if at all, over the course of their friendship and relationship about international relations, arms control, U.S.-Soviet relations, the Cold War. And George arrived in Washington at a time when Reagan, as many of you remember, was on a big military buildup, very belligerent language about the Soviet Union, sort of parting from the policy of containing the Soviet Union, which had been the Cold War policy, to trying to roll back the Soviet Union. And he didn't really fit in that group around President Reagan, and he ran into a buzzsaw of opposition. It took him 3 years to overcome that. And that didn't happen, by the way, without a huge assist from Nancy Reagan, who wanted to see her husband achieve something in international relations. So by the time you get to the second term, this is when George kind of consolidates power, to use a Washington term, becomes the key advisor and partner with Reagan on Cold War issues. And you can see, to go to your question specifically, Reagan liked Shultz, respected him, trusted him, but he didn't rely on him in his first term. There was a little bit of a distance between the men, and over time, that distance narrowed, and then we get to these scenes that you alluded to where they are working hand in glove together to try to bring the Cold War to an end.
Quick follow-up on that, because it strikes me, you're saying those first few years from 82 and 85, they're kind of more distant, and then 85 they come together. Of course, that's when Gorbachev emerges.
Right.
In some respect, the close working relationship may have been a result of the new Soviet premier,
Absolutely.
who was someone that President Reagan felt he can do business with and enter the Secretary of State to try to facilitate that occurring.
Yeah, so I think the way to think about it, the Cold War would not have wound down and ended absent Ronald Reagan, George Shultz, Mikhail Gorbachev, and Edward Shevardnadze. It was the four of them. And if you pick one of them out of that quartet, it might not have evolved the way it did. The main point of my book, the biography, is if you were absent George Shultz, I don't believe it would have happened at all. But it did require that kind of rare moment in history when you have an alignment of four leaders willing to look outside conventional thinking. And it's interesting, all four of them came from outside their capital city and outside the mindset of their capitals. George grew up in New York, went to Eastern schools, came out to California. Reagan was a Californian.
You could say Princeton, it's okay.
Yeah. Reagan was a Californian. Gorbachev grew up in the south of the Soviet Union in an agricultural region, and Shevardnadze, of course, was Georgian. So they did not grow up invested in the shibboleths and the beliefs of the Cold War. I think that's one of the main reasons they were able to break through.
Go ahead, Karen.
Yeah, I want to disagree just a little bit. I appreciate your insights, but I think that we don't really know the inner workings of the Shultz-Reagan relationship because no one was truly close to Ronald Reagan. And if you look at his diaries, they don't reveal much about even the disputes among his cabinet members, in particular the one with Cap Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense, and Shultz. He's incredibly diplomatic in writing. He doesn't reveal his hand. And that's why I think the Reagan books that I did did so well, is that they started the process of revealing just a little bit about Reagan. But we know so little about what he thought about anyone, including members of his family. So I think having a working relationship didn't mean that
Nancy
there
was pretty clear about.
She even said it. That there were times herself when she didn't know. So their working relationship didn't mean that they were really necessarily in sync. When Edmund Morris, the official biographer, was asked Reagan, "Who's your best friend?" he said Judge William Clark.
Yes.
And I think that that's absolutely the case, that they had a lot more in common as Californians, as horsemen, as even social conservatives, none of which really fit George Shultz. And so I think it's just important to kind of remember that. And as important as the four members that you mentioned of the American-Russian team, Soviet team, were to the end of the Cold War, I think Margaret Thatcher, the Pope, and Solidarity in Poland really should have equal billing, because without their activities and insight in Europe and bringing Europe along, I don't think it would have been possible for the Cold War to end. And it was Margaret Thatcher who said around 1984,
Yeah,
it's all over but the shouting. She could see the future at the end of the Cold War before the Berlin Wall.
And she saw Gorbachev first, right? She
Yes.
was
And
the
she
one who
identified
encouraged
him.
Reagan that there was an opportunity to
Right, and
business.
before the INF treaty,
Yeah.
that there was a leader in Europe who could see that the future was coming.
And don't forget Helmut Kohl.
Yes,
Because
so
Helmut,
the list keeps growing.
Helmut Kohl, against tremendous pressure,
Yeah.
permitted the deployment of American intermediate-range missiles and nuclear tip missiles in West Germany.
Yes.
And George thought that was one of the pivotal moments to bring the Cold War to an end, because that put the Kremlin on notice that there was no way they were going to push the United States around.
The Euro missiles
I
for sure.
agree.
Let's pivot for a little bit just to the personality, the person, George P. Shultz. And Francis, I'll move over to you to talk about the military side. I only had a handful of opportunities to spend time with Secretary Shultz, but one I remember was impactful was it was a small dinner at the Reagan Library in their Oval Office replica, and everybody was introducing themselves. And of course, the last person to introduce himself was George Shultz, who didn't need an introduction. But when he said at the table, I imagine he did this all the time. When it got to him, he said, "George P. Shultz, Marine."
Right.
That's right. Well, we've heard that before, and that I felt was as much true to himself as it was just to kind of make the people around the table laugh. But in terms of his appreciation for service members, for service, how important was that for him as the Secretary of State, and then a lasting legacy for someone who served and supports those who serve? Yep, I think you use the mic.
Hi, hello. So this became an interest of mine, not because it has anything to do with Central America, which is what I'm really researching, but I kept coming across George Shultz and his incredible affection and affinity and love for the service and for the Marine Corps. And so there's a couple things. I mean, the op-ed that you referred to a little while ago, right when he turned 100, he ran sort of a top 10 greatest pieces of advice article in the Washington Post. And one of those pieces of advice, it was number 4, I believe, or sort of an anecdote, was about his time as a Marine during World War II in the Pacific. And he cited by name a sergeant from his unit who had been killed, and the impact that that sergeant had had on his life and his leadership. And so my takeaway from that, almost 80 years later, was that he felt so strongly about this one man who led in combat, led his Marines, and therefore absolutely affected George Shultz's life and his way of treating a team and of leading. And so he wrote that, upon his 100th birthday. One of the things that I did find in his papers, which really fascinated me, was a back and forth between Shultz and the Commandant of the Marine Corps during the Reagan administration, whose name was P.X. Kelly. And so in 1986, you probably remember, there's rebels raging in Uganda, 1984 to 1986. And there was a Marine detachment in Kampala there to protect the ambassador in the ambassador's residence and the embassy, which is what Marines do abroad for the Department of State. It's diplomatic security. And so this one Marine had written a tale, essentially. It was like a chapter out of a Faulkner novel. It was 7 pages of one sentence, this Marine going on about the work that he had done as a sergeant. And a sergeant, at that time, was probably a 22-year-old young man, served for about 4.5 years to become a sergeant. And he'd written this incredible story about protecting the ambassador and the ambassador's residence in Kampala. Now, this story had been sent to his commander, who was a captain, and that had been sent to his brigade commander, who was a colonel, and that was sent to P.X. Kelly, who was the Commandant of the Marine Corps, this handwritten letter. And P.X. Kelly sent it to Secretary Shultz, saying, look at this Marine, look at this representative of the United States protecting the ambassador abroad. Look what he did. And George Shultz read this long letter from this young Marine and wrote back the most beautiful response to the commandant, also recommending that this young Marine be awarded a medal for his valor. And that, to me, really spoke of Shultz's understanding of what it meant to lead, but also what it meant to follow. And that's what I think we've all been talking about to a certain extent, that he is such an incredible man because he was able to build a team of trust. And you don't see that very much anymore. You don't see that on a bipartisan level. He worked very hard to pivot quickly. I wanted to talk about this bipartisan commission that he pushed, and he put Kissinger in charge. But the most important thing about this commission on Central America that George Shultz really spearheaded with the help of Scoop Jackson, who was a Democratic senator, was that it was equally representative of both sides of the fence. And it did amazing things for Reagan. It got Reagan's policies pushed through in Central America. It got more money from Congress. And it was really because Shultz embraced the idea of a team, whether those teammates were Democrats or Republicans. To him, it didn't matter. It was the mission. And the mission is what's important to a Marine.
Kyron, I want to go to you because you had the personal relationship with George Shultz. And I wonder if you could just reflect on how he impacted you, your career, and kind of when you think of those personal interactions, what you might share with the audience, what's top of mind when you reflect on your interactions with him.
So we've been talking about what a wonderful leader he is and how he builds teams, but he's also someone who can be tough on his team. And we have here, and I will be remiss if I don't mention him, Ambassador Paul Wolfowitz is here tonight. He's seated with the Tobys, and he played a critical role at the State Department during the Reagan administration. He was so much better at his job than I was. I had the job that he had. He found a way.
This is the policy planning
He
job.
found a way to get out of it.
He was just getting it ready for you.
Yeah, he found a way to get out of it quickly and move on to the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs. And I've heard that he became a much nicer person when he got out of policy planning. But Shultz is also someone who did not suffer fools and could be very tough. And you would know, I mean, there was some, potential for Irish anger, and it was always there. I remember working on the memoir. I was still in my 20s, and Henry Kissinger was coming to visit us at Hoover. And I said, well, I think I'll join that meeting. And he said, only if you don't say a word. And but he was, I think, a loving person. He was someone that it's quite remarkable that in every decade of his adult life, he was relevant to that decade. And he kept reinventing himself. I think the post-Secretary of State years are some of the most interesting because he was working on issues that someone at his age wouldn't. Energy, technology. He was looking to the future. He was in the conversation.
Yes.
In his final years, he began to talk and write about managing over diversity. He could see that America was changing.
Explain what he was focused on.
I'm not sure exactly
Okay.
what he meant, but I think what he meant was the future's here. With immigrants, with Americans with diverse talents from diverse backgrounds, and they will be more part of the future than we've ever seen in the history of our nation. It won't look like, I think in his thinking, the way it did when he was coming along in the 1950s and his time at MIT. But he was trying to really talk about those issues, and there was a moment at Hoover where I think he was close to 90. And he gave one of our talks in July, you were probably there, to the board of overseers and to the major donors and the fellows. And he had to be seated at that point, his legs, he was struggling. And he talked about managing over diversity. And he said something I'd never heard someone say at that point, and now we say it every day. But he said the dangerous border is not the U.S.-Mexico border, but it's the Mexico-Guatemala border. And then he went into a deep conversation about migration And so every major topic, 21st century topic, in these new decades, he was relevant to the conversation.
Yeah, it kind of reminded me of, I talked about the dinner I had with him, which was a fond memory, and then this traumatic memory is I once had an opportunity to present in the Board of Overseers at the Hoover Institution, and Secretary Shultz was there, and I was asked to speak, so I gave my presentation and finished, and he was seated to my left. I think he was like 97 years old at the time, and he proceeded to scowl and critique everything I said. It was okay. Well, so it was a learning moment, but he did not hold back clearly until 97, and I imagine the years after. But Philip, why don't you talk about your relationship and perhaps some anecdotes that capture that relationship, your role. I mean, the book you're about to publish and the exclusive access you've had. How did that may perhaps come about? I mean, we'd love to hear a little bit more about that. Give us some insight into your relationship in the person.
Well, it began on an airplane, and Paul Wolfowitz was on that plane when George was flying to the ASEAN meeting in the early 80s. I forget which year. I think it was 83. And it was my maiden voyage with the Secretary of State. The New York Times diplomatic correspondent of that era, Bernie Gewirtzman, had demurred to do something in Washington that needed doing. So that was when I first met him. And then I took some other trips with him when he was secretary. Early on, I think it was after this trip that took us to Manila and Bangkok, and then we went on from there to the Middle East. He says to me one day, he pulls me aside and he says, "I hear you play tennis." And I said, "I do, Mr. Secretary." He said, "Bring your racket next time." So next time we were on a trip through South America, and I brought my racket. And I'm in my hotel room in Rio, filing my story and whatever's going on. The telephone rings, and it's the executive assistant to the Secretary of State. Says, "The Secretary would like to meet you in the lobby in 30 minutes and then go play tennis with you." So I go, and off we go to this court in Rio. And I, set myself up on the other side of the net. And I thought to myself, okay, what happens now? Can I beat the Secretary of State in singles?
Never got to ride on the plane again.
So fortunately, the day was saved because he said, "Let's just volley." So we never had to play a game. But we played again in Moscow later. So my relationship with him was friendly but appropriate for a journalist and a government official. It was not particularly close. And then when I was working on the book I did about the effort to eliminate nuclear weapons that George was critical in leading with Henry Kissinger, Sam Nunn, and Bill Perry, and the late Sid Drell at Stanford, he pulled me aside one day. This was a great George Shultz moment. Okay, those of you in the Bay Area, you know the big game, Stanford Cal, right? We're at a pre-big game lunch at Stanford with the leadership of the two universities, and George asked me to come over to the corner with him. And he said, "What's your next book project?" And I said, "I don't have one. I'm trying to finish this book that I'm writing about you and Henry and the others." He said, "Would you be interested in writing my biography?" And I said, "Well, that's quite an invitation, thank you." And then as an inducement, he said, "I'll give you exclusive access to my archive at Hoover. It's sealed until I die." So long story short, I spent, close to a decade working on this book. I interviewed him literally dozens of times, traveled with him, and spent a great deal of time in this archive, which you now fortunately have access to. And our relationship never got close because I think we both understood it couldn't. And the arrangement that I made with him when I agreed to do the book was very simple. I said, "George, it's your life, but it's my book." And he said, "I completely understand." And to the day he died, he read chapters of the book before he died. He never once tried to bend the book in a direction he wanted.
Wow. Did he point out documents you might want to look at after reading a chapter, or you might want to talk to that person?
Yeah, no,
I mean,
he would say, I don't know if you're giving enough emphasis to this or that,
Right.
or I don't remember it that way, but that's fine.
I recall being in his office. He would mention something and he'd call in his assistant and
Yeah,
pull out a document. I mean, he had this kind of encyclopedic.
Yeah.
Karen, I don't know if you want to add to that, but he seemed to have these things that on the tip of his tongue. Or
He did, but he never, I give him great credit for this. He never once said, I wish you would change this. So I had complete editorial independence, which is, I think, extraordinary. Doing a book about someone as significant as George Shultz, I think most historical figures would want to lean on their biographer to shape the book. He never did that.
I wanted to throw a question, Karen, and maybe you want to react to something Philip just said, but it relates to it. George Shultz later in life really focused on ridding the world of nuclear weapons. Nuclear zero was a priority. Obviously, collaborated with others like Henry Kissinger. Why do you think that was? Why did that kind of come into just sort of high relief for him in those years after leaving office? Maybe you can comment on that also, Francis.
I think that's one of the areas where Reagan may have rubbed off on him, because Reagan also abhorred nuclear weapons. And if you read his statements, Reagan's in December 1987 around the Washington Treaty, the first nuclear disarmament treaty of the Cold War, he said, almost jokingly, this is what I had proposed my first few months in office. And so I think that's where they actually met on this issue of ridding the world of nuclear weapons. And in his later years, I guess they were called the Four Horsemen.
Right.
And, with Sid Drell and Sam Nunn and Henry Kissinger, and they had conferences at Hoover. I think it was a passion for them, and they were thinking about the future, their great-grandchildren, their grandchildren. They wanted to make the world safe. And I think it was really driving so much of what he did. And it goes back to my point about being relevant in areas that he hadn't necessarily been a dominant voice at the final decades of his life. I also wanted to offer, I think you were trying to press me for something more personal about Shultz. He played a key role at the Hoover Institution in terms of making sure that we were a community. And he cared about fellows, and he cared about staff, and the way he treated people. And when he would hear that something had happened, he would often show up in someone's office, never mine for some reason, but he would show up in offices and just talk to people. He got word that my father died more than 10 years ago. And I saw him in the hallway, and he said, I'm having my annual Kissinger party, and I want you there. And I thought, this is just so horrible. Why would I want to go to a party? I'm now planning a funeral. But I went to the party, and we just sat together at the Penthouse in San Francisco, where Charlotte had put on this great party. And it was just really reassuring. We didn't say that much, but we just sat together. And I think that's the way he often helped and supported his colleagues, not always in words, but in deeds.
You mentioned Charlotte. Question from the audience is, how did Charlotte's influence affect George Shultz in his career? Maybe, Philip, you can comment on that since you're covering
Well, Charlotte was a wonderful partner for George. Those of you who knew Obie, George's first wife, you could not imagine two more different women than Obie and Charlotte. Obie was very quiet and reserved, unflashy, and then Charlotte, the sort of, wonderful, outgoing, ebullient figure of San Francisco and California. And I think what she did was to bring out the joy in George. Maybe it was a function when you're Secretary of State, there's a certain soberness about what you're doing. Once George and Charlotte got together, this exuberant George emerged, loved going to parties. They were the sort of toast of the town, as many of you know. Some of you were probably there at City Hall a number of years ago for this extravaganza where George dressed up as Superman, and Charlotte was the damsel in distress being lowered from the ceiling, yelling, "Help, help, help!" And George rips off his jacket and there's a Superman shirt underneath. I mean, frankly, if someone had told me that George Shultz would do that when I knew him as Secretary of State, I would have said, "What have you been smoking?" So
That's some influence. Okay. We have just a couple minutes left, and I want to get at a couple of questions from the audience. Let's deal with current events here for a second. Maybe we'll go down the line. Russia's just brutal invasion of Ukraine, the war that we're witnessing and watching every day. Where there was a living former Secretary of State that made headlines a couple of weeks ago. His name's come up a few times, saying we have to come up with a strategy that doesn't humiliate Russia, right? And it was kind of the ultra realist Kissingerian way of looking at a conflict and countering this impulse to stand with the Ukrainians in freedom. Would George Shultz take that tack vis-a-vis U.S. policy with Russia's war in Ukraine? I think we're running out of time, but give us quick answers going down the line. Francis.
So my quick answer is that it seems to me that everything George Shultz did had a morality underpinning it. And so I'm not sure what he would do with Russia and Ukraine, but it would be a moral response, I believe, rather than a coldly realist response.
I have no doubt he would have supported the arms aid that we're giving Ukraine. I think he probably would have been restrained, as Biden has been, about putting American forces into Ukraine. I don't know what he would have advised as the war reaches a kind of standoff or a point at which negotiation might go. I don't know. I dare not guess whether he would have settled for some kind of political deal that would carve off part of the eastern Ukraine. I don't know.
I agree with what I've heard so far. I think morality and foreign policy was critical for him. And I do think that he would have supported as much arms aid short of war, which is actually really hard to do, but he would have been at the forefront of supporting it. But two other things. I think he would be returning to all of the work he did on energy independence.
Yes.
And so, and he would focus probably on Germany and Nord Stream 2. And there, I think he would be trying to make ground as quickly as possible. And then finally, I think he would be focusing on the Germans in a larger way. This now is not the Germany of Helmut Kohl. The anti-Americanism, the tilt toward Russia. I think he'd be working on the diplomatic front to bring Germany back into a pro-Western, pro-American stance. He'd use that opportunity.
Let's take a zoom out for a second. I got very focused on the headline of the moment of today. But Karen, why don't we stick with you? We're obviously in this moment of great power competition, is the Washington policy way of talking about it. But the rise of autocracies, China, Putinism. So there's rhyming with the Cold War and the challenges we had then with the Soviet Union. What do you think are the salient kind of lessons from George Shultz's diplomacy during the Cold War that may be applicable to how we ought to address today's challenges with 21st century authoritarianism?
One, back to our earlier point about human rights, because once people understand that you care about them and that you separate people from their regime, they actually trust you more. And that was a lot of the Reagan-Shultz story, is that they never condemned the Soviet people, the Russian people,
Right.
but the Kremlin government. And I think they would be making that distinction very boldly during this time with the rise of authoritarianism. And also, I think they would spend less time on great power competition than statesmen are now. They did something that I think should be done again. We call it now the Global South. But the Reagan Doctrine was an attempt to meet the Soviet regime on the ground in the developing world and make it a lot more difficult, Afghanistan, Angola, and Central America. And that's what we need to do again, not so much direct competition with China and Russia, but if we can persuade the emerging powers in the Global South that Ambassador Wolfowitz works so hard on, the Indonesias of the world and others, India, Pakistan, Nigeria, Brazil, there's no future for us without some deep ties with those countries. I think that's what Shultz would do.
Philip, do you have any thoughts about kind of salient takeaways from George Shultz's diplomacy during the Cold War that are relevant and applicable as we deal with these challenges?
Well, he was certainly prepared to conduct diplomatic discussions with not just authoritarian leaders, but totalitarian leaders, which is what the Soviet Union was when he first took office. I think, he was, at the end of the day, a pragmatist, and as I said at the beginning of this program, the consummate problem solver. So I don't think that George would be someone who would say we cannot talk to Putin, as obviously difficult as that is now and as irrational as Putin somehow seems to be. He would try to figure out how to conduct some kind of conversation with Putin and President Xi in China, and look for ways to moderate the tensions in the world, because that ultimately was what he tried to do and achieved when he was Secretary of State, was to moderate and then end the Cold War.
Francie, what strikes you as you?
So the one thing we didn't talk about, and I'm surprised we didn't yet, but most of us all know it, is Shultz's theory of diplomatic gardening. And I think that's actually very important nowadays, right? So
Explain
he
that. What is
wrote,
that?
in his memoir, he wrote this very beautiful few paragraphs about what it meant to be a constant gardener as a diplomat, which essentially meant you treat your diplomatic relations as a garden that you need to care for and prune and tend to and water, but you also need to weed. And so my sense now is that in some circles, we are tending our garden in very small ways, or we'll look at certain regions of the world and we'll tend that garden, but we'll ignore, to Chiron's point, other regions of the world. And I don't think that George Shultz, if he were alive today, would have done that. I think he would have recommended that we tend the garden equally in the Global South, to your point, and in Europe and Russia and in China. And so I think we can learn from that, but I think it's a very beautiful way of reminding those who lead that it's important to nurture those relationships, even if they're difficult relationships, totalitarian relationships, dictators, you name it. He was a master at nurturing those relationships as a diplomat.
We talked about that metaphor. Was he actually a gardener, Philip?
Well, he has a farm in the Berkshires, which his parents had purchased, and he inherited it. I spent a long weekend there with him. Actually, it was very gracious of him to invite me and to set up the opportunity for me to interview his children who were there that weekend. And we went to Tanglewood. We listened to Yo-Yo Ma play Dvorak's cello concerto. George cooked steak over, white hot coals, which he loved to do. I did not see him lift a finger in the garden.
The metaphor only.
Let's stick on the personal side. Perhaps not a gardener, but you obviously had opportunity to engage with his family. Question from the audience. I was curious about who was George Shultz's best friend, and why was this person, assuming he had one, was his best friend?
Well, he had best friends at different stages of his life. So there was Topper, who was a classmate in Englewood, New Jersey, where he grew up. Then they went off to different prep schools and reunited at Princeton. And he was very close to that person for many years. In his time in government, I think, he was not ever close friends in a kind of intimate friendship way one might think of with any of the people he worked with. Because
We talked about Caspar Weinberger before,
Yeah,
and a fellow San Francisco
and he and Cap
resident, but
Weinberger did not see eye to eye on many issues, and there was a kind of personal friction between them that I get into in the book. But the friendship I would point to, the one I could witness myself and almost feel the power of, was his friendship with Sid Drell at Stanford. And those of you who did not know Sid was one of the world's great people, a world-class physicist who devoted himself, as George did, to the nation's service, working as a consultant over the years to the CIA and other government agencies. They didn't meet until George stepped down as Secretary of State. And when he came to Stanford, the two men got together and they bonded. And it was just a wonderful thing to see that friendship develop over the years. It was quite poignant. And Sid died first, and it left a deep sadness in George for a while. But that was a really special friendship.
why was that? Why did they come together?
Because they shared this passion to eliminate nuclear weapons, and because George understood that Sid was a world-class expert on physics and nuclear weapons technology. He was not, George Shultz was not. And so he relied a great deal on Sid for technical advice, especially during this period when George was focused on the effort to eliminate nuclear weapons. And I think, yes, Henry Kissinger played an important role. Bill Perry played a critically important role. Sam Nunn played a critically important role. But I think that the relationship at the heart of that initiative was the George Shultz-Sid Drell relationship.
Kind of pivoting away from the personal, but hitting on this very important policy area in terms of nuclear weapons and in terms of national security. And we'll wrap up with this one here. We're in this world now where the salience of nuclear weapons is really increased. Of course, these arms control agreements are no longer just between the United States and or it's not relevant if it's only between the United States and Russia. And Russia, of course, and the United States no longer are bound by the INF Treaty. China, of course, is modernizing, as well as others developing programs. North Korea, Iran. Do you think, Karen, that would change George Shultz's outlook given the way that events have unfolded, or the approach would remain the same as it had in his later years?
I think it probably would intensify his efforts. And we faced it in the Trump administration for really the first time, that any future major nuclear weapons agreement can't just be bilateral, and that China has to come to the table. And that's an incredibly difficult problem. And I think Shultz would have loved to be in that fight.
I think we're going to have to end it here, but another problem we wish we had George Shultz solving for us. Wish we could spend more time, but we've reached the end of tonight's program of the inaugural George P. Shultz lecture. I want to thank the Commonwealth Club for hosting tonight's event. Another thanks to Toby Philanthropies and Ted and Diane Toby for the support of tonight's program. If you'd like to revisit this or any other program of the Commonwealth Club, you will find the video on the club's YouTube channel or website. I'm Roger Zackheim. Tonight's Commonwealth Club program is now adjourned. Thank you.